Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the co-creator of digital horror magazine Razorblades, the horror magazine, and the writer of Department of Truth, Something is Killing the Children, and of course, Batman. It's James Tynion IV. Thanks for coming on, James.
Thanks for having me.
So instead of what a lot of people probably expect us to talk about, Batman, we are going to be talking about the perfectly timed. I want to know, this is going up, what is it, the 26th? So this is Halloween week. We are going to be talking about horror comics today, also your horror comics. But I want to start. I was reading like the intro to the first issue, or I was actually reading an interview you had done previously about Something is Killing the Children, and you had talked about, you know, how much you love Stephen King, and you talked about all the horror stuff that you love. And I am interested as to where your love of horror stories kind of comes from, because it seems like that's like one of the, I don't know, if you can have a foundational genre, that's it for you. Where did that start?
I mean, honestly, it started by being a really scared kid. That is the biggest thing. I went growing up, and especially the thing that always stands out in my head is the fact that I was the kid who would go to my local Blockbuster and I would always walk down the horror aisle, but I wouldn't make eye contact with the video cassettes. I would always just sort of like get the slightest glimpse of each of them, and I would be terrified. I would have nightmares about what I thought those stories were about. And I would like kind of occasionally I would even like ask my parents if they knew what something like Hellraiser was about. And I would just be told like, you're too young for that and all of that. And it built up this really, really strong like aversion that lasted even until high school for me. And even though I was really fascinated by a lot of the trappings of horror, like I would draw skeletons. I would draw ghosts in my notebook. I love Nightmare Before Christmas. There were all like, and Tim Burton in general was a huge thread, but horror itself, like the real stuff, like just it was too much. It was one step too far. And it really wasn't until late high school, early college that my friends started like forcing me, like, because some nights you lose when everyone's trying to decide what movie you're going to watch. Sometimes like the one you want doesn't get to be the movie. So I started watching some of the horror movies, and the thing that I found is that they were nowhere near as scary as what was in my head.
Right.
And that started a much deeper fascination with it. And I wanted to know where were the lines, and then once I started realizing that I had really, really scary things in my head that weren't actually in the movies, I wanted to start writing those things myself.
Yeah. I love that you actually had that you would go into the video store and you would just try to keep it on your periphery and everything. Because I did the same thing, except for my favorite video store was this place called Family Video. And naturally, with the place called Family Video, they hid the horror stuff in like this weird tiny room. And I remember it was near the bathroom, and I'd always like say I have to go to the bathroom, and I'd walk through it, and I would just be like, people can't see that I'm peering off to the side, but I'd just be peering off to the side. I remember the first one I rented, I think, was I convinced my parents to let me watch Critters, and like basically all of the Critters movies, which are like, if I watched them again, they're probably like not Tim Burton, but definitely like horror comedies to a certain degree. And so, but I was always kind of interested, but I could never jump into like Friday the 13th or like Nightmare Before Elm Street, particularly Nightmare Before Elm Street, because there was something about, I don't know. I had Scott Snyder on not that long ago, and we were talking about like the primordial fear of darkness, like with Noctera and everything like that. And I think something about dreams, there's something really scary about dreams. And so that was something I couldn't get to, but I think it's interesting that it was always kind of like on the periphery for you. It seemed like you were always kind of edging around it, where you were like, you liked Tim Burton, but you couldn't step that far. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why it's such a fascination to you as a writer, is that the versions in your head of what horror could be were actually far worse than what you actually experienced.
I think that's absolutely it. Like, and I think that because, in other genres, it was a bit of, a weird kind of one-upmanship. Like, I would read like a fantasy series, and then I would be like, okay, can I build my own fantasy world Like, and what does that look like? And I would start sketching it out in my high school notebooks and everything. But it wasn't that wasn't my relationship with horror. It was all kind of protectionist. It was all me like trying to save myself from the genre. And in doing that, I started building a bit of what I think like is my own brand of horror there. And I started creating like weird rules for myself. Like I knew I couldn't handle horror movies, but I started reading horror books before I allowed myself to watch horror movies. So it's like, when I started with Stephen King and Carrie, which is very, it gets very scary in places, but it's for one, a quick read, and it's about like teenage angst and all of these things that I was feeling like very much in my day-to-day life. So I was able to connect with it really easily. And then from there, I started going through the seminal, Stephen King works, and that created enough distance that I could, I was always more comfortable with like living in my head. And funnily enough, the thing that made me finally okay with gore on screen was not a horror movie at all. I watched all of the seasons of Nip Tuck, and that like wiped out any reflexive like aversion to gore, just because they went all out in that show. It's like really messed up. But
it's not a horror show. I mean, it's like definitely horror adjacent. I mean, that's one of the funny things though, is like a lot of these genres. I mean, it's like you look at Army of Darkness. You could call Army of Darkness a comedy, but it's also very much a horror movie. And I mean, same with Evil Dead 2 and even Evil Dead 1 to a certain degree, depending on how weird your sense of humor is. But I do think that's interesting. I also think it's interesting that you had rules, because I feel like horror is a very rule-driven genre. Like you look at like vampires, very rule-driven. You look at mostly really any monster, it's very rule-driven. And I think that's really interesting because I don't know. I mean, it just feels like everything in you. This sounds like a weird fate, but I swear I mean this in a good way. It feels like you were kind of always building to being deeply interested and then implementing these ideas that you were interested in horror, because like even like the things you were accidentally setting up fit the genre.
And like honestly, I think part of it is I always approach media like a weird research project.
Okay.
And that's how I got into superhero comics was like is similar in the fact that I watched the X-Men animated series, Batman animated series, Spider-Man animated series. Those were my real touchstones, but I didn't get really into the worlds until I started getting these guides to the X-Men and like these encyclopedia style books that laid out like, here's who all the characters are, here's what their backstories are. And then from there, I remember at one time I went into when I was in or earlier than middle school, actually, it would have been like, third or fourth grade. My dad took me to a comic shop, and the book that I wanted was The Essential Guide to the X-Men, which was essentially, it was like over the course of 6 issues, it described every single issue of Uncanny X-Men through the early 90s. And it's just like, shorter than 2 sentences describe every single issue.
Those are some packed sentences.
Yeah, they very much so. And it was really, really fascinating because it wasn't until sort of my adult life that I realized that I hadn't read a bunch of those comics. I had just read summaries of them, but I just knew them from that and from references of those stories in later stories. So it was, I always sort of come at it from that angle. I'm still the kid who's like, cataloging dinosaurs and all of that, even when it comes to horror and superheroes. And yeah.
Well, I mean, it fits what you were saying. You were saying that, like, with like a fantasy story, you want to find what the fantasy story is and then build off of it. If you're going to have to build off of it, you have to research first, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I did want to jump into like the horror comics part because, you talked about books, you talked about movies. When did you first start getting into horror comics? It sounds like comics were definitely first, but at what point did like your fascination with horror comics start?
It would have been through reading Vertigo books. And so it sort of came through a side door because, when I started sitting down to read Sandman, I didn't see Sandman as a horror comic. I saw it as more of a superhero adjacent comic because, I hadn't read Swamp Thing before I read Sandman, but, it was one of those books. Like, I lived across the street from a Borders Books, and that allowed me to sort of go in and read through the entire bookshelf that they had there. And all of Sandman had been released at that point in the early 2000s, and so but they had a complete collection of Sandman there, so I started reading it from the beginning on, and it like that was such a revelatory thing for me. That just got deep under my skin, and it's one of the things that made me want to write comics, because beyond just the horror of it, it was like, it was doing things with mythology and weaving together all of these different ideas into one big story that was just like, it felt like it was able to touch on everything I was interested in. And it made me a Neil Gaiman fan for life. It made me like really, really attached to Vertigo, and so it really expanded out from there. And through Neil Gaiman, I found Alan Moore, and reading through the Alan Moore works, particularly Swamp Thing, and then honestly one of the big ones that I was able to find, and this probably through illegal means, given that it was we're talking like circa 2005 in that era of the internet and the series availability. But I read Miracle Man for the first time, and Miracle Man, especially like when it amps up with young Miracle Man's attack on London, it was one of the scariest things I'd ever read in a comic book, and one of the most disturbing things, and something that really sat with me. And so it was all of those pieces that were kind of, swirling together. And this was happening concurrent to me being like, oh, I don't like horror and I won't watch any horror movies. So it was sort of like, at that time, I wouldn't have called any of those comics horror comics, but then obviously they are all horror comics. And I think like Gaiman and Moore, in particular, out of the Vertigo writers, they have that, like, the core pedestal of their genre work is horror, in the same way that I would say like a lot of the other Vertigo players, it's not necessarily horror. There are, I'd say Grant Morrison is more science fiction, and same with Warren Ellis, and but horror, it's the writers who are truly rooted in horror that speak the most to me, and always have.
Yeah. I think you have a very interesting I mean, I think the idea of like growing up on the cartoons and then being near a books, like, I mean, I grew up going to books or Borders also, and like just going through there. I did not live close to there. I would only be able to go there when my mom wanted to get a book, but I'd get through as much as I possibly could. And then, I mean, also like those, like the books you were talking about, where it's like almost kind of like the Wikipedia type entries and everything like that, with the essential X-Men and everything like that. I think that's a very common background, especially when it leads into Vertigo, because Vertigo, I think, especially for people who are growing up kind of around, it sounds like the time we were growing up, that was like our first foray into something that wasn't really superheroes necessarily. Yeah. And it really expands your horizons. I mean, granted, I also was reading Bone at that time, but that's also kind of like a step towards comic strips to a certain degree. Yes. That is not me defaming you, Jeff Smith. You're awesome. But anyways, I do think that is a common background. I am interested in, so we were going to talk about some favorite horror comics. You've already mentioned some, I'm guessing, but what are some of your favorite horror comics, and what do you think makes them stand the test of time for you?
That's a really, really good question. And I think there's something about that whole era of, like, I mean, because I feel like I'm always discovering my new favorite horror comic, because there's something so experiential about horror, in the same way it's like, the same way a person's favorite comedy is going to change over time, because your favorite comedy from 10, 20 years ago isn't going to make you laugh today like it did back then, except for some very rare exceptions. And horror is sort of the other side of the coin from comedy, and it is all about the reaction. And it's, and especially being as interested in horror as I am, I love finding things that are sort of novel, like something that are making me see and feel something that I haven't felt before with a horror comic. Uh, which is a lot to say that, this year, strangely enough, I read From Hell for the first time. And the
Okay.
reason that I read From Hell for the first time this year is that I decided in high school that I wanted there to be one great Alan Moore comic that I hadn't read yet. That I always wanted to sort of there to be the carrot at the end of the stick that, like I didn't want to run out through, like, wrap up his entire uh his entire bibliography. And I was doing the exact same thing with Kurt Vonnegut at the time. My goal was to read every Vonnegut book before I read Slaughterhouse-Five. But then I gave up on that in college. And then and with Alan Moore, I had a copy on the shelf for so long, but it became just my stubborn, like, oh no, I'm going to wait for the right moment. But then COVID became the right moment, and I sat down with it. And I think that it's one of the most extraordinary comics ever created. Like,
Hmm.
I think that it is almost perfect work of both horror and comics. And so that's really, that's really shaped a lot of it. But some other favorites, I'm really, like, recent favorites that I'm just sort of tapping into right now. I really have been enjoying the Go Tanabe adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft that are coming out in the U.S. through Dark Horse. And there's a whole bunch more of his Lovecraft adaptations that I'm desperate for them to adapt and bring over here. But I am absolutely in love with that. I love Junji Ito. I feel like that is now, there was a moment that, like, I would say 4 or 5 years ago that was an interesting answer to the question, but now I feel like, we're on the verge of the Uzumaki animated series coming out on Adult Swim. So it's like, I think now people are aware. And
Wait. I
beyond
will
that,
say, Uzumaki, I actually just read for the first time this week after you emailed me,
awesome.
because I've owned it for years. I was in Portland and I went to Floating World. I don't know if you've ever been to that shop. Great
Yeah, yeah.
shop.
Not
And
personal, but I've ordered from.
so I went in there and I just asked, I was like, I haven't read a lot of manga. What should I get? And the person was like, you should read Uzumaki. And I was like, oh my God. I looked at it and I was just like, I'm already scared.
Yeah.
And anyways, and I ended up buying it, and I just kept looking at it. It's like, I don't know when I'm going to be able to read this. And finally, I read it because you emailed me. And I was like, I got to read this. I have to do it. And I was just like, it was one of the most unsettling comics I've ever read in my entire life. It was
Yeah.
genuinely terrifying. And I think it's really interesting because there's such a mundane element to it. Just like getting obsessed with spirals and like it kind of tearing a town apart and everything like that. I just found it to be, as I was reading it, it was weird because I was like deeply unsettled and I was reading it really late at night. And as soon as I finished, I was like, man, that was really intense. Like, I'm stressed out. And then the next thing I did was I went to look to see if I could find the second and third volumes for purchase at a comic shop. And so I was like, I both hated it because it made me feel very uneasy, and then I loved it because, and it made me want to buy more of it. Horror is such a fascinating genre in that way. It's like
Absolutely.
it chases you, but it also chases you to doing more of it. It's weird.
Yeah. No, it is really, really, really weird, and I'm glad that it had that reaction, because that's honestly that's the thing that still stands out, and I think that Uzumaki is probably the best example of it in comics, especially contemporary comics. But horror comics, despite there being such a huge history of them in the medium, there are plenty of things that you can't really get away with in a horror comic that the medium doesn't actually handle well. Like, you can't really do a jump scare. You can't really shock someone. And there's so many tools that every other medium has that comics like weirdly don't for horror as a combination of visual, like text and visual. Like you can't, like the reader is always going to control the pace at which they're reading.
Right.
Like, and that is, and it's something that you can mess with, and you can kind of throw some bricks in their way and try to slow them down, give them big blocks of text, like things that sort of control where their eye moves. But at the same time, if you turn a page, you can't have the horrifying image at the end of the second page, because when you turn a page, you see the whole image before you start reading that piece. So you can't surprise someone with down there. But what you can do is you can build a sense of dread. And
right.
Dread is the most important emotion when it comes to horror comics. It's just that tension, that building tension of just something strange and unsettling that then you can then release with a big shocking image. Right. And that Uzumaki does so well. And that's like the thing that when I revisit that's the thing that I'm trying to sort of tap my brain back into.
I do want to give you credit. I also read this week. I've had Something That's Killing the Children, the first volume, for a while, and I'm sure you're similar to this, but I have this massive pile of stuff to read.
Yeah.
Anyways, I read it, and you are very, very good at building that tension as well, because like in the first issue, I love James, who is just like, hanging out with his friends, and then transitions into the police station, and it's just like, and then it transitions into like Erica, and it keeps building and building and building, but you're always kind of just showing enough to keep the plot going, but you're never showing everything. And so once you get to that point, it's a hammer. It hits. And I think that's, like you're saying, that like there's some things that comics are not necessarily good at when it comes to horror, but being able to build tension, especially, I mean, I'm not saying that it wouldn't work in single issues, but working in a trade paperback form, you get to build to that point. And I think that is something comics can be very good at.
Yes, I fully agree. And I think I think the best horror comics tap into that. So I'm happy to hear that Something Is Killing the Children is working on that front for you. Like, but yeah, no, this is the I'm trying to think back to your question, like what are the other like great horror?
Yeah, can I throw in one?
Yes, please.
So my favorite person for horror across the board is Emily Carroll. Just anything Emily Carroll. I mean, obviously Through the Woods, but like just going on her website and just reading the stuff that's on there, and like the way that the format is used as it scrolls down, then like different size pages and everything like that is just like astonishing. Actually, this morning, last night, I don't know, time zones are crazy. Shortbox is having a sale, and I actually just bought the Shortbox book that Emily Carroll did there, and everything Emily Carroll does is just astonishing to me, and I love the way that Emily plays with formats. It's just brilliant. I have family members who are like horror obsessed, and Through the Woods is the only comic that I've ever gotten them. No,
honestly, that's a great choice. And I remember Their Face All Red. When that came out, seeing that come out online, and it like spread all throughout the comics internet really, really quickly and understandably, it was a revelatory thing. It was something that because not only and it reads incredibly well in a book format, but the infinite canvas is something that actually does horror really, really well. And right now there are only a few places that are really leaning into it. I know there was this one Korean comic that was going around for a while that was a really fascinating piece, and I wish I knew the name of it. But it was an infinite scroll that at some point in the scroll it took the control of the scroll away from you, and all of a sudden rapidly pulling you down the page to a jump scare.
Yeah,
and it was one of the only times that I've seen that sort of thing, and it's blurring the lines between comics and like motion comics and all of that. But it is. I wish I remembered the name.
I love the idea of stealing control from you, though. That's like such a fascinating thing to do. I didn't even know you could do that. That's amazing. Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but do you think that I mean, there's always kind of, I feel like there's always a difference in horror movies, or at least there was for a long time, where it was kind of like there was like the big ones, and then there was kind of like the cult ones. Do you think that there's to a certain degree a divide like that? Because I feel like everyone knows Lock and Key, but or like, I mean, I guess like depending on how you qualify like Hellboy or something like that, everyone knows those as like horror comics and stuff like that. But I mean, I guess Emily Carroll's like more like somebody. I'm not trying to make it seem like it's an artist type thing, or it's like the band that not everybody knows. But it's interesting that like something like Lock and Key is so commercial. It still works. It's great. But I wonder if is there a divide there in comics? Do you think like, or is there not?
I honestly don't think that there is that big of a divide. I think that horror is as a genre lends itself towards innovation. Because you're always trying to find a new way to make a reader interact with what you're putting forward. You're always trying, you can't scare someone tomorrow the way you scare them today. So, I think in the history of comics, I think the horror has often been the genre that like actually pushes the medium forward. And that's why, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, like the horror writers came in and I think changed the game in a huge way. And then, and I think that happened a generation prior with, with Bernie Wrightson and the House of Secrets, House of Mystery. It's something that I think happens again and again. And like in manga, it's also looking at some of the most popular manga around. Like Death Note is a horror story. Like it's a deeply strange psychological horror story about a boy and a demon, like and a powerful demonic artifact. And it's I think that there is something about horror as a genre that it always has the potential to break through and get that kind of mass market appeal. And I think it's because horror as a genre tends to tap into the big cultural fears of a given moment.
Yeah.
And so there's also something about good horror that always feels relevant. And so even people who don't necessarily, there are plenty of people who don't like horror, but they will check in on the who they will go ahead and go check out Get Out when that comes out, and is obviously a big cultural piece in the of the moment, because they understand that this is something that's speaking to this. So when something interesting happens in the horror space, I think everyone who works in that medium sort of goes and looks at it, because it's just like, oh, this is the thing that could be teaching us the new tools that will help us make good comics in the future. And I think that and then there's a step beyond that too, where I think the people want something novel. And I think horror is a place that they are more open to something novel than they are in some other genres. Like even fantasy fans and science fiction fans have certain types of science fiction and fantasy that they like, and
Mm-hmm.
they want to see the version they like more often. And I think that there are plenty of people but I think horror fans aren't quite as rigid. I think that they like to experience a new thing.
Yeah.
I'm sort of rambling.
No. I
Yeah.
mean, I completely agree with that, because I think that speaks to you look through like the decades and how it's like constantly evolving. There's like slasher movies, there's like found footage movies, there's whatever the hell you call it, Midsummer and stuff like that. I mean, honestly, like one of my big ones, I was. And you, I hate to say it, not to defame your name, but I honestly thought that Homecoming, you and Josh Hickson's comic from the second book of Razorblades, was horrifying, because I find home invasion stories to be really scary. I mean, like Us did that really well. I mean, depending on how your mileage may vary, like The Purge does that well, things like that. And there's something, I mean, there's something very again, primordial about like your space being violated in that sort of way. Like when you come home from a nice day at the beach and you walk in and all of a sudden there's plastic sheets all over the ground and there's just a dude with monsters behind him. I'm like, no, thank you. I'm out. But I do think that it evolves. One other name, this is not actually a straight horror person, but when we're talking about manga, I think that Naoki Urasawa is really interesting in that regard, because while like Monster is definitely horror leaned, but even like something like Pluto or like 20th Century Boys has like a perpetual sense of dread that kind of permeates through the books. Not really Master Keaton. Master Keaton's kind of happy, but at the same time, it's just like there's a sense of dread there, and I think that's interesting because even when you're not ostensibly horror, you can still have hallmarks of the genre within your work.
Yes. No, and honestly, I think that Naoki Urasawa is probably my favorite comic book creator in existence.
Yeah.
Like, I think that, like he grounds everything in that kind of psychological horror, like, and just like in putting people in extreme emotional states where they're trying to figure out who they are and what they're up against. And it's just it makes for really, really, really compelling drama. Mm-hmm. And I'm very, very drawn to it. I actually just upgraded my entire collection of 20th Century Boys. So there's all the perfect editions are like stacked up on my dining room table.
I loaned my nephew all 24 volumes of the series, and I was like, I could either just get them back or not get them back, and then try to get the perfect editions, because the perfect editions look amazing. But well, let's talk about Razorblades. Razorblades, the horror magazine. It's your digital horror magazine that you co-created with Steve Fox. I really liked how you shared its story in like the first issue, and that it like stemmed from you reading From Hell, and you tracking down the anthology it originally came from, which was it Taboo magazine? Is that what it is? Yeah. Or excuse me, I guess the first 4 chapters were serialized there, and then you wondering, why aren't there more anthologies like this? So I'm sure you've had conversations with retailers who have said things like anthologies just don't sell.
Yeah.
But clearly your experience suggests otherwise. What made you think that doing this now would work? Or was it not even about that? Was it just about, I want to do this thing and see what happens?
Yeah, it was very much about, I want to see what happens. It was, with like flashing back for a second to like March, early April this year, and just how weird and scary it was, even in a way that I feel like we're detached from right now.
Yeah.
But there was this moment where I was building towards the launch of Department of Truth, but we didn't have a solicit date yet, and Image wasn't had let me know that they weren't going to be able to pay me the advance that I was contracted for the book, and which meant that I had to be paying for the whole thing out of pocket. And I had no idea whether or not the book was going to come out this year, and I had no idea. And then on top of that, and my other creator-owned title of the year, Wind, was going to be an original graphic novel that wasn't going to come out until November. And now all of the books that for later in the year were already being pushed back. So all of a sudden my year looked like had just been cracked in half,
right,
and thrown away. And at that point, I still, there were huge questions about how long I was going to even be on Batman and all of that. And it was this terrifying feeling that every external force is in control of my creative output, and I have no control over it. I can continue, making this other stuff, but even my DC contract only allows me to do certain things.
Right.
So I started, but I wanted to do something. I wanted to make something, and and because I read From Hell, and From Hell knocked me on my ass, and it was just this incredibly powerful experience that made me ask a lot of questions. And one of the biggest questions that it made me ask is sort of why, at this moment in the comic industry, do things like From Hell not exist? And, and specifically From Hell, because the special thing about From Hell, that aside from the incredible craft that went into it, is that it's really, really bizarre that that Alan Moore, and this is peak Alan Moore era. This is like he has just come off of the heels of Watchmen and V for Vendetta, the U.S. release of V for Vendetta, or maybe that actually may have been a few years later. So I'm screwing that up. But it's just like this is Alan Moore as one of the top writers of the mainstream superhero comics.
Right.
Like, he was not an indie entity. He was this big force in the mainstream. And then you had him paired with Eddie Campbell, who was best known for Alec, which I see on your shelf behind you, and which is more or less an autobiographical comic in the kind of black and white style that indie comics were that had in that moment. And it was the idea of the pairing of those two creators. Like, it would be like if Jeff Lemire suddenly did a book with Adrian Tomine.
Right.
That the fact that there isn't that interplay, that's the thing that really got under my skin. And it was looking back at that moment, and I started not only buying Taboo, on eBay. I bought a full run of Taboo, but I also started buying issues of the Comics Journal from the 80s and early 90s, back when comics were a more united medium, and alternative comics had not sort of gone and walled themselves off in a corner where they were very happy to sort of just be interacting with themselves. Obviously there, the international comic scene wasn't really engaging in what America was doing. It had its own, everything became so closed off. But in that moment, in that late 80s, there were these first moments of the all different sides of the medium were talking to each other and interacting with each other, and cool shit was coming out of it. And it was coming out of it entirely because of creators just sort of interacting and seeing each other's work and talking about each other's work. And so, so all of a sudden it was just I wish, I felt the loss of that. I felt that it was just it's so weird that we live in a comic industry where the top creators of the mainstream direct market, there are plenty of people who I'm sure are in that corner, have no idea who the top writers of the indie alternative scene are, who the top writers of the book market, YA market, and nobody seems to know who are the contemporary, not 10 years ago, who is currently the number one top writer in Japan. And there's all of these elements that are happening. There's so many facets of comics, and there's so many walls put up between all of these different corners. And I was just I wish there were more places that we could kind of meet.
Yeah.
And do it, just make cool shit. And I think a big part of that is how corporatized the direct market has gotten. And I think that, and I don't I don't necessarily even mean this entirely as a value judgment, because obviously I do a lot of work at Boom, and Boom counts as one of these players. But it's just we live in a direct a direct market scene where Image really is the only game in town of pure creator owned comic.
Right.
And Image is still run by the same people who ran Image 25 years ago. And so everything is still kind of, refracted through their lens.
Mm-hmm.
So the rising generation has no platform that it controls itself where they fully own their own work.
Right.
That is messed up, and that has not happened. Like, that was not the case in previous generations.
Yeah, I mean that period you were talking about in the late '80s, that was also right when like the self-publishing black and white boom was happening too, right? So, I mean, like that was a banner time for innovation. I do think it's really interesting though because I've long thought, I mean, obviously you look at the Japanese market and anthologies are massive, but I've long thought that the idea that anthologies wouldn't work in America was a creation of basically our collective unconscious, not necessarily what the reality would agree with. And I think it's, I mean, partially it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like retailers don't think it's going to work, so they don't order it, and customers don't buy it because they've never really seen something like that before. But it's interesting when you present the opportunity for something like this, when you put it on like a democratic option where anybody can buy it whenever they feel like it, like Gumroad, all of a sudden people buy it. And I do think that's interesting. I do wonder, there's so many different ways you could have done this. Like if you did a Kickstarter, it would have been one thing. Or if you did, if you tried to publish it through some sort of publisher as a quarterly, I don't know if it would have hit in the same way as it did through Gumroad. But I'm curious, why did you decide to go that route?
I mean, there's one very, a very simple reason, which is the fact that I am still a DC exclusive comic book creator, which means that I have a limited number of projects that I can work on for other publishers. But there's a kind of loophole in all of that. And, when I got permission, I reached out to make sure that it would be okay for me to do this. But they don't have the same concerns if you are publishing your own work.
Right.
So doing it myself, like that opens that door. The other thing, I have my own little prejudice against Kickstarter anthologies. And I don't mean that in terms of the actual quality of the work itself. But I think that Kickstarter in general relies on this. It's very hard to build momentum off of Kickstarter because you are trying to get people to buy into a thing that then they won't, and then you're removing them actually receiving that to like potentially like 6 months later,
right?
If not longer. So when you finally receive the book, I mean, what happens when you receive a comic that you bought on Kickstarter? I bet you do the same thing that I do, and I'm sure a lot of people do, where they move immediately to the stack rather than be like, oh yeah, I was so excited about this like 6 months ago, I'm gonna read it right now.
Yeah, you tapped into like the panel syndicate premise, which is immediate heat. I mean, like Friday comes out, what do? I buy it and I read it. I mean, like that's just kind of what happens, and I think that's actually really smart because in the state of things in 2020 where you have limited attention, if you throw in a 6-month gap or more, you lose people. You lose that momentum. It's really tough. And I think it was really smart.
Well, thank you. And I mean, like, that's sort of the core premise, is that I wanted to get it right into people's hands. And then the other simple thing is that this was just something I wanted to exist in the world. And I came into it knowing what it would cost for it to exist in the world. And my goal in funding this is not profit. It's making sure I don't lose money.
Right.
Like that's more the thing. But this is the benefit of Batman. Batman allows me to put more money forward for this project, and it makes it less important that the project be profitable.
Right.
So my goal, like at the end of the day, is how do I cover costs for an entire first year of this book? And that's part of why, for this, latest round of releases, we have the idea of the annual subscription and stuff like that, which, those like through the annual subscriptions, that helps guarantee we will get through issue 5 and it makes it so I don't have to have like an aneurysm worrying that I've just like thrown like all this money into a hole and that it's never going to come back. But now, so like, but it's something that I am comfortable with funding this for a year, and I hopefully don't lose money on that year. But it will like, but I also am kind of confident that you know at the very least, like we've done this, as bare bones as we can while still trying to attract real talent and paying them. And I do want there to be a nice collection at the end of that first year that will be, I hope will be, a must have on the shelf of any horror comic collector. And so doing that, and like the single issues become more of like that's a fun stuff for the collector market, and then the digital side of it all is available for anyone and everyone at whatever cost. And then my goal is more to just get people's attention with it.
Yeah.
And trying to get it in front of as many people as possible, which is why there's going to be an ad for Razorblades in the back of every issue of Department of Truth. There are ads running this month and next month in DC Comics 17 and older, for Razorblades, which I was shocked that they let me do.
Yeah. I actually had several questions about that.
In there, I tried to get an ad for Department of Truth, but they told me no. But once again, self-published, I'm not technically like a rival publisher, even though I am my own upstart rival publisher.
I love it. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how, and I'm not saying that you did it for this reason, nor am I saying like trying to defame any processes, but like some of the stuff you did with, especially with like this latest round, are like, to a certain degree, like direct market tactics. Like you did the foil covers, and like that's obviously going to attract a lot of people, and it's going to be at a higher price, and so you're going to be able to like it. You're able to, in a similar way that Batman is able to fund it, you're able to use those foil covers to kind of like lift the whole thing, even if you really just want people to read this. It's something they gain from it because they get this cool foil cover, and you gain from it because you get a little bit more revenue to fund paying everybody for the work.
Exactly, and I mean, I think it's because at the end of the day, you can still buy it for literally $0 as a PDF. I feel like we can be a little more shameless in terms of like, hey, here's like, we're going to use the tools that will move copies that we're hoping that it will also create something special for the shelf. And it's like, and I think that one thing that, I feel like this is happening because every time I start going down one of these eBay holes, like I start noticing that the prices keep going up.
Yeah.
But I've been buying a bunch of horror anthologies from the 80s, and it feels like every single week though they're going up, which just means there's a big demand right now. But like especially a lot of the Clive Barker stuff from Eclipse Comics and Epic from the 80s and early 90s. But it's it's I think that there is this sense where it's like, do you want this kind of special thing that helps embody this moment? And this is a moment. Like, this is something that I think is extremely exciting. But it's like, it's obvious that horror comics are having a huge resurgence right now.
Right.
And, but like the last time there was a massive like resurgence of horror comics was the 80s into the early 90s, and it almost lasted a decade. Mm-hmm. And we have no idea whether or not this round is going to last a decade or if it's going to be a bubble and pop in just a couple of years. But I do think that the only way for it to continue is to do like weird, honest, like horror that pushes the limits of the genre and gives a platform to tell the stories that some of the more like investment capital driven publishers are not going to like, aren't going to fund and aren't going to like help exist into the world. So It's just like, so that's all part of my evil plan.
I do think one of my favorite things about reading the first two issues is it really feels like everybody's in the lab. and they're just like they're cooking up and they're doing their thing. And I think it's really interesting. Like, okay, so I'm just going to list off 4 of my favorites. I'm not saying that I didn't like the other ones, but I loved Homecoming by you and Josh Hickson. I love Cinderside by Alex Packneedle and Jason Liu. Somewhere to Keep My Things by Tyler Boss, Matthew Rosenberg, and Mike Spicer, and then Local Heroes by Marguerite Bennett and Werther Deladera. Oh my God, that one just murdered me. That was tough stuff. But it's interesting because every single story is so different. Like you look at Rom V, and oh my God, I forgot who the artist of his story was.
John Pearson.
What's that?
John J. Pearson.
Yeah, I mean, like that is so different than everything else in the entire book. You have pinups by like Jen Bartel and like oh my God, like Josh Robles and all kinds of different people, and it's really interesting. Or Nick Robles. It's really interesting to see all the different ideas of what horror is to people within this book. And I am interested. So you and Steve Fox are doing this together. Obviously, there's a very diverse lineup of like new creators, very popular creators, etc. But one thing you said in the intro that I had mentioned earlier was that you wanted to make a horror anthology that isn't nostalgic to anything.
Yeah.
Did you and Steve give creators any guidance or say, you know, this person's doing that, so maybe don't do this? Or is it just like, do your thing?
There were some guidelines. Like the biggest thing was, and even though there is a story that kind of breaks the rules in issue 2, but like the core guideline is we wanted to do something that has 1 foot grounded in the real world. Mm-hmm. Like we did not want to go like we wanted something that felt like vibrant and in the moment. We didn't want horror hosts if people are dealing with more classic horror archetypes, we've asked in a few cases, like, can you push this forward or do something a little more innovative with it? Like, you know, the goal is to try to speak to the present moment, like, you know, in some way. And there are so many different approaches to that, that, you know, like, it's not something that we're going to be like totally rigid on, but we didn't really want we don't want that kind of a story that still feels like it could have been run in a 1950s EC comic.
Sure.
Like, you know, I mean, there are, which isn't to like say anything against that, but I feel like so many horror anthologies lean into the language of horror anthologies rather than lean into how can we actually play with the medium to do something new in the horror space. And new is the sort of guiding notion.
Yeah,
I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with like EC comics or anything like that. It's just it's against the mission statement of what you're doing effectively.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
You know, honestly, like I think there's a lot of really interesting things done in each of the stories, like the washing machine where you had like the time was just changing within the panels and everything like that. That was wild. Also, I'm pretty sure Andy put Harry Dean Stanton in that comic, but I'm not entirely sure.
He absolutely did.
But it's really interesting seeing all the different perspectives. I mean, you even have illustrated prose in there, which I think is really fascinating. It's like, it's not just different takes on horror comics, it's different takes on the ways you can do horror within this type of story. And I think that's really great because, you know, I think that, like we talked about, in horror, there's always kind of like a feel of the moment. And this is kind of like everyone is finding the next moment. And that's really interesting.
Yeah. No, and I like that is the goal. The goal is I wanted to create the playground for some of this comes from the fact that my career started really early. I wrote my first published comic when I was 24 years old, and it was for DC Comics, and that was 8 years ago, and I've been building up. But it's the most exciting thing for me about the current moment is that a lot of my peers, like my age group, the people who would have been in high school around me, are now coming up and doing their own work, and at a level where they're fully expressing what they want to do. And I think I have also hit that level in terms of what I want to do. And so I wanted to create a playground for us. Like that is the real thing, where it's just like, how can we build something entirely on our own terms without the gatekeepers of these, like, of the major comic companies and investment capital and all of that, and do a book that simply exists because we want it to exist, and not trying to, like, make $1 million or anything like that. Like, do I have an idea if anyone wants to talk to me on a, like, movie TV side that could, play into Razorblades? Sure. But it's like, that's not the point of this. Which is also why I'm not retaining any of the rights.
Right.
Like, to any of the stories. Like, this is, I'm not even retaining the rights to my own stories. In this, it's like, I mean, I am, like, my own share, but, like, Tiny Onion doesn't get a share on top of my own share. Like, it is this, like, that's the real essence of it. And I think that, I think this year more than anything has hammered in to me that I am not, like, I'm going to be moving more and more into arenas that I control what I put out into the world. And and I want to make a place to make cool shit with me and my friends that is not only stuff that I want to, like, create, but is also stuff that I want to read and enjoy. And and I'm willing to put my own money forward to do it. Like, and it's like, that's, that, and I think that's sort of the heart of that whole process, is that this is my weird experiment, and we'll see whether or not it continues past year one. I would love it to, but it's like, right now we're just going to make this first year really, really fucking good. And we have a bunch of incredible collaborators who are going to be coming on board from all corners of the industry. And but with a real focus on the new class, and that is also part of the goal here.
You're making Hassan Otsman El How very happy, because he is a busy man with your book.
Oh yeah.
I do. It's interesting, because I've long felt that we're, well, not last few years. There definitely felt like there are opportunities for people if they're willing to take it. The problem is doing something like this is risky. I mean, you didn't know how it was going to turn out. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, because as the pandemic started, I found that there was, like, really kind of two camps for the way the creators went. One, kind of batten down the hatches and lock in the work you can. Or two, make the magic happen, find something new, do something different. And I think that's really interesting. I'm interested, though, we know the fans have responded to this, readers have responded to this. As you've seen kind of proof of concept, if you will, have you found more creators have reached out in interest of wanting to participate?
Yeah. No, like, there's definitely been an expanded interest, and especially within the little, like, the one benefit is that a lot of the creators of horror comics, we all are already kind of, like, talking and tweeting at each other at all hours of the day. And then on top of that, we're tapping into a whole new community that I've been excited about for a while, but I haven't had a place to really use any of them, which is the horror illustration community on Twitter. Which some of them have sort of made some small forays into comics, but mostly they're, selling prints of their stuff. And there's actually a weirdly more of a interplay between indie gaming and the horror illustrators rather than indie comics and the horror illustrators. So it's bringing in people like Tyler Henderson, who created Siren Head, this great, like, cryptid character that exists in a bunch of images all over the internet, and sort of giving him some space to play in the book, and then sort of building out this whole Rolodex of horror illustrators, a bunch of whom I'm now like bringing in to do variant covers for Department of Truth, and I know some of my other my other horror peers are tapping into the same crew and bringing them in for their own work. I know Vault's reached out to a few folks as well. So like that's also that's part of the exciting thing, is being, being able to like that's what I wanted to happen. I wanted there to be a kind of interplay, and I think that's the first most obvious interplay. And then, we have some people coming up who like in future issues who are much more in the indie young adult space, and the like really from a bunch of different corners. Some people out of animation and things like that who we've used the press we got, especially at the launch of the first issue, to kind of be like, hey, we are legit. Please draw spooky things for us, and that has thankfully worked pretty well.
Well, I just have a few more questions. I had a patron question from Jeff Weira. He was wondering about writing horror versus writing other projects, because horror, you talked about it, like you were talking about like the jump scares and pacing and all this different stuff, because horror relies so much on like the visual experience. Like, does your writing experience change because of this? Like, for example, is writing Wind different from a scripting standpoint when you know how important the visuals are for horror? I mean, not that they're not for Wind, versus something like Something is Killing the Children, or something like Homecoming.
I mean, Homecoming was honestly really, really fun to build, because there actually isn't a script for it.
Interesting.
I laid out what I was interested in doing in a few paragraphs and talked to Josh about them, and we sort of went back and forth on that. And then he was like, "Oh, I could totally lay out these 3 pages just from this conversation." And I was like, "Yes, please." He does an amazing thing where when he turns in his layouts, he also turns in an audio file, which is him basically explaining,
oh my god,
why he made all of the decisions he made. And it's just like the coolest fucking thing. And like Josh and I have talked about doing more extensive projects in the future, and I've been trying to like get a hold of him to work together since I read Shanghai Red a few years ago, because he is absolutely fucking incredible. But yeah, I'm very, very excited. I was very, very excited about that one. But honestly, the thing that I would say is the most like, I write Wind the exact same way I write Something is Killing the Children. It is, and most of my indie work, I write dialogue first, and I write essentially a dialogue flow, and I know the visuals in my head, but the visuals sort of are the second tier that come in. I don't lay like, I will write a full 20 pages page script as a pure dialogue flow with no panel breakdowns, and then I go through and I do the panel breakdowns and change what needs changed and all of that. And now I have a good sense of it now. I'd say I didn't used to end up with too many pages or too few pages, but now I have a good sense. My Batman stuff in particular, I would say my detective run, I wrote a lot more in that style, because it was so dialogue driven. But with my Batman run, I'm trying to be much more action driven. So I've actually been moving more towards my stuff I'm writing for 2021 for Jorge Jimenez. I'm writing more in a pure plot style, but I was writing the stuff earlier this year, especially when I was working with a hodgepodge of different artists issue to issue. I was writing in a hybrid style. So it's I would say that I end up, I'm more consistent in how I script my creator owned than I am in my superhero work. Superhero work, a lot of times it's like, okay, what works with this artist and how quickly can we get the script out the door?
Yeah.
And sometimes, which isn't always great, but now we're like working so in advance for 2021 that I'm still writing plot style, but it's actually like I'm excited because it means that when I finally dig into dialoguing, I'll have art for like 3 issues in front of me,
Yeah.
which is really good.
I imagine when you're working with it like heavily depends on the artist too, because I don't think that Department of Truth's Martin Simmons is somebody you want to put in a box too much. He just seemed, I mean, like, that last, I don't want to, I feel like this is a big spoiler, but let's just say that there's a last reveal at the end of the first issue that involves like some crazy, I mean, there's a, God, I'm trying to remember. I think there's like what is the pyramid with the eye and all this stuff? Like, there's that going on. And I can't imagine, maybe you did script it exactly like that, but everything that Martin did is just like, I don't know, terribly unique in a very good way.
I think part of it is I write very pared down scripts. I am not. I will before I write a script, before I start, like I write big pitch documents. I will write like a 25-page pitch document. And there is a 25-page pitch document for the Department of Truth that lays out a lot of the core ideas and the core settings and the characters and all of that. But then when I'm actually in the script, I tend to just describe the setting and describe the emotion a character is having and who's in a specific panel.
Mm-hmm.
So then when we go a bit more abstract, like especially in Something is Killing or especially in Department of Truth, I do tend to basically be like, hey, here's the flow of information on the pages here, but let's hop on the phone and talk about it. Mm-hmm. Like, because it's less about a specific thing, and honestly, it's just sort of trying to challenge. Sometimes I throw some specific ideas in there, and it's just like, all right, can I get Martin to like yell at me? There's definitely some wild imagery in issue number 4 that he's working on, and that is, like we'll see if we get in trouble for it. But
yeah,
it's gonna be an interesting one.
Well, the last question about all the work that you're doing, it keeps coming up in my brain, and I have to ask, why Tiny Onion Studios?
It is every mispronunciation of my last name.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's me playing off of that.
Tiny Onion. Oh yeah.
And so so that's where it comes from, and it's an idea that I had back when I was in high school, and it started as just being my little, like when. Like I'm incorporated for tax reasons, yada yada, and so I just created that as the name of my business, and I've become attached to it. So now I actually, so when I was creating it as an image, and I reached out to Dylan Todd, who did all of the design for both Razorblades and Department of Truth as well,
which is great. He does great work.
Yeah. And he put together the Tiny Onion logo that exists now. And, the big idea that I sort of put forward to him when I was giving him the brief to do was just like, imagine like because it's an onion has many layers and yada, yada, yada. It's just like being presented with something very small and strange. Because what I was originally pitching was like, is it a hand holding out a tiny onion? But it ended up just being this tiny, like a symbol in itself with the spiral out. And the spiral, like, I don't think this was even the intent, but it kind of speaks to Memetic, which is another one of my horror series. So like that, I'm a huge fan of the logo. I have a big magnet of it on my fridge over there, which now it's on the back of comic books, which makes me happy. See whether or not and it's inside every issue of Department of Truth. I haven't had the conversation with Image about like, hey, what would happen if I stuck this on the outside of the book?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find that one out.
I actually really like it though. I mean, I like that creators. It's not an imprint, but it's not an imprint. It's interesting because it's like a brand that crosses publishers. And it like Scott Snyder has Best Jacket, which is really like kind of posted up at Image. But I like that those types of things are happening because then it becomes the creator as the brand in some ways, which I know that some people might like kind of bristle at the word brand, but it's like you think about like Miller World, you think about like Giant Generator, you think about all these different names, and like those are like that's impactful. That bundles everything into one house, regardless of where it comes from. And I think that that's, I don't know, an important change for creators in some ways. And it kind of in some ways feels like it kind of builds off of the original Image idea where you had all the individual houses for each person.
Yeah. No, and honestly, I hope it's something that more people do, because I think that it's I mean, I'll say, like, this is the nightmare that like keeps me up at night sometimes, is the fact that almost my entire library is at Boom Studios, and if Boom Studios just vanished tomorrow, like, I don't know if any of those books would ever be in print again.
Right.
I don't know what the road to getting those books in print again would be. Like, and it's something that, and it's happened so many times in comics. It hasn't happened recently, so we sort of forget it. But it's like looking at all of these old Eclipse books that have been out of print since the 80s.
I mean, you mentioned Miracle Man.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I remember when I first read about Miracle Man in like Wizard magazine, and I was like, I don't even know how I could possibly read this comic. I feel like I've read it because I've read about it so many different times, but I've never read it.
Yeah. No, and it's hard. It's like that. So that freaks me out, and I am doing everything in my power to make sure that I have my own space. But it is something that I think that there's like, it goes back to what I was saying before. I hope that our generation can do more to sort of take control of our own industry as we are the rising generation. Because I think the generation directly before us, like, there are people who sort of graduated and created their own little spaces in comics. And it's like, you have, obviously, Bendis has Jinx World, Mark Miller has Miller World. Like, you have these little platforms, and like Robert Kirkman is Skybound in at Image. But it's just like, what I would love to see is more spaces that are fully owned and operated by my peers, who I think, and it's just like, because I think it's just a true thing that the rising generation is always going to have its finger like closer to the pulse of what the medium actually needs and wants and how it can move forward. And I think that the more control that we seek and that we get will be better for the industry at large. And that is like one of my core core views. And I'm, and because of that, I think that, the real truth is that as I'm working on Batman, and there's not an end point to my Batman run at this point, but it's just like, when I'm done with Batman, I'm not looking to jump over to Marvel or anything. Honestly, I think that if I write, it'll probably be a few years after that before I write superheroes again. And I would do it in a space that I fully own. But it's just like that total ownership and total control over your own work and also your own brand. And that is important, and it is necessary in the modern world.
Yeah. Well, and I spoke to it earlier, but I do think that there's more opportunities for that control now than there were. Like, you look at the 80s that we're talking about. I mean, honestly, like, you look at some of those self-publishing books that did as well as they did. I mean, honestly, it's kind of a miracle that they did. But anyways, let's close with the most controversial question. I do want for this season, I do want to close with something a bit lighter. Halloween is Saturday. This is going up on Monday. What's the Halloween candy you rep the hardest for?
Oh boy, that is a really good question.
I'm a Reese's man. Reese's peanut butter cup. I even have power rankings for all the individual ones. This is peak season though, because pumpkins are definitely a top 2 one for me.
See, I think I have to go with Snickers bar. Like, just a little mini Snickers bar is always, like, I am always in the mood for that. Yeah, no, I think that's what I'm going to have to go with.
I like it. I mean, honestly, Snickers, I did this big world trip where I traveled for half a year in 2011. And the one constant across every country I went to is it was easy to find a Snickers bar. Great. It was great little fuel to keep going, but I like the pick. James, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Razorblades, horror comics, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm just telling everyone, go to readrazorblades.com and order physical copies or digital copies or whatever you want. But they're on sale right now, and physical copies are available until midnight on Halloween.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer James Tynion IV. You can find him on social media at James IV, his horror magazine Razorblades at readrazorblades.com, and on Twitter at readrazorblades, and his work in Department of Truth, Something is Killing the Children, Wind, and Batman. Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out Sketch, my subscription comic site, for long-form articles, interviews, and more. And consider subscribing for access to all of the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Megan Marsden, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Phil Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kingus, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Fowles, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.